Over 58% of global foreign exchange reserves are held in US dollars as of 2023, far surpassing the euro 20% and other currencies. Central banks worldwide prefer holding dollars because of its stability, backed by the robust US economy. Over $12 trillion in international debt is denominated in US dollars. Around 40% of global trade is invoiced in US dollars, even in transactions that do not involve the US. It is estimated that 60% of US currency circulates outside the United States, benefiting the US economy indirectly. The US uses the dollar's dominance to enforce economic sanctions, cutting off adversaries from the global financial system, e.g., Iran, Russia. Nations like China and Japan, which hold vast reserves of US dollars from trade surpluses, reinvest them in US assets, funding the US government and economy. Sounds like the United States holds an iron grip on the global money game, reaping massive benefits from its unrivaled dominance. To know how the US started dominating the global economy, we have to travel back to 1944, to Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, USA. It was the time when the Great Depression had highlighted the dangers of uncoordinated monetary policies and trade protectionism, which led to competitive devaluations and economic instability. The interwar period saw the failure of the gold standard, creating a need for a new system to regulate international currencies. The war devastated economies worldwide, and there was a need to rebuild infrastructure and economies, particularly in Europe and Asia. On July 1st, 1944, delegates from 44 allied nations, including representatives from the Soviet Union, China, France, and other major economies, gathered to establish a new international economic order after World War II. With the war nearing its end, there was a clear need to create a framework to promote economic stability, prevent another global depression, and facilitate reconstruction in war-torn economies. Can you imagine the power and influence this conference room would have had? But wait, two people in this conference had the highest aura. It's Mr. Harry Dexter White, a senior US Treasury official from the US, and Mr. John Maynard Keynes, one of the most influential economists of the 20th century, representing the United Kingdom. At the end of the conference, several agreements were made, but most were in favor of the US based on suggestions made by Harry. Few important agreements were: Number 1. Creation of the International Monetary Fund to oversee exchange rate stability, provide temporary financial assistance to countries facing balance of payments problems, and foster global monetary cooperation. Countries would contribute to a pool of resources which could be accessed by those in need of stabilization loans. Number 2. Establishment of the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, which is now the World Bank, created to finance post-war reconstruction and development projects in war-torn countries and promote long-term growth. Number 3. Harry suggested pegging the US dollar to gold at $35 per ounce. Other currencies were pegged to the US dollar, creating a system of fixed but adjustable exchange rates. If you have not heard of what pegging is, it is a system introduced as a way to simplify transactions and solve the impracticalities of using physical gold or other precious metals as currency. In the pegging system, the value of the currency is pegged to a specific amount of gold or another standard. However, John suggested creating ICU, International Clearing Union, that would use a global currency called Bancor as the unit of account for international trade instead of the US dollar, which was never implemented. Number 4. The conference underscored the importance of reducing trade barriers and promoting open markets. Leaning towards Harry's suggestion, weighted support voting in the IMF was implemented, giving the US significant influence on the institution due to its economic contribution. Now the US has around 16.5% of the voting power in the IMF, granting it effective veto power over major policy decisions, requiring an 85% majority. The US controls about 16% of the voting power in the World Bank, similarly influencing key decisions. Both institutions are headquartered in Washington, D.C., providing the US direct access to their operations. Emerging economies, particularly China, India, and Brazil, argue that the voting structure is outdated and does not reflect the modern global economic landscape. Despite their growing economic influence, these countries have limited power compared to the US. That's why the BRICS nations are planning to break the dominance. Let's see how the US used its influence to dominate. The US heavily influenced the Marshall Plan and World Bank efforts to rebuild Western Europe, ensuring the region aligned with US political and economic interests. The US used the World Bank and IMF to counter Soviet influence by providing financial support to non-aligned and pro-Western countries. The US has used its veto power to block reforms in voting structures that would give more influence to emerging economies like China and India. Since the US dollar is considered as the pegging standard, countries had to use the dollar to simplify international trade. This was a huge advantage to the US in liquidating its currency and stabilizing its economy since then. Nations relying on dollar reserves or dollar-based trade are often influenced by US monetary and fiscal policies. Exporting nations like China and Japan use their trade surplus dollars to purchase US Treasury bonds or other American assets, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of dollar demand. Oof, the US has a long history of dominance. Do you still think they were just lucky? Tell us what you think in the comments.